Okay, welcome back. This is Module 2 in the Social Work Policy series. At the end of Module 1, we were talking about Families First, which is TANF in Tennessee, and we looked at some of the major components of that, who it benefits, what's provided, what are the requirements for it, why it's provided, the goals, who can provide it, those kinds of things, and also the time limit on that particular program. So now let's continue looking at how policies can be categorized. We use that one as an example of the particular purpose because we were looking at living assistance under benefits.gov. Let's look again at benefits.gov at the different agencies that are listed there, because I want to show you how agencies, as we just touched on, about how TANF is a federal program that's administered by the states. And so if you look at the agencies on benefit.gov, so just like you can go and look at benefits by category, you can look at them by agency, and you see some of them listed here. And so just like we were looking at the particular service for family assistance underneath the category of financial assistance, here we can look at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which is the umbrella agency that it basically administers the program to the states, and then the state administers it directly to beneficiaries. So with a lot of programs, there are multiple levels involved in multiple agencies. So at the federal level, you have the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and within that, you have the Administration of Children and Families, or the Administration for Children and Families, and within that, you have the Office of Family Assistance. So sort of three layers there of the federal agency. And at the state level, you have the Department of Human Services, but within that agency, you have the Families First program. When we looked at Families First, we talked about the fact that it's targeted towards families with children in poverty. But defining poverty within this program is pretty complicated, and you'll see what I mean as we go forward here. So on the left-hand side of the Tennessee DHS, Department of Human Services website for Families First, you'll notice that there are resources there for applying for services, what's the eligibility, and other information there. Some specific for beneficiaries, some that might be a little bit more interesting to other stakeholders that are not direct beneficiaries but are interested in the program in some way. And you can find some limited information there about eligibility, but obviously it doesn't go into all the intricacies of the eligibility requirements. If you sort of do a search with Google and search specifically for Families First eligibility manual or Department of Human Services manuals, then you kind of find this webpage. This webpage is not something that easily comes up. You have to use Google to find it, but you can search for program manuals or publications and manuals of a given state agency, and often you'll find this kind of thing. And what you have here is three links specifically that look at eligibility. One related to technical eligibility, meaning different requirements that people have to meet. The resource eligibility, which relates to how many assets do people have. In other words, they may not have the income, but do they also have assets that they can use instead of income? And then income eligibility. But you can see there's a lot of other policies listed here as well that are separate policies that relate to TANF. And that does not even include going directly into the state law through like a LexisNexis search of Tennessee state law. But also there are documents that are hidden from public view. So for example, if we were to go in and look specifically at income eligibility, that particular document that's linked on that previous page we were looking at, within that, it talks about, in part 5 here under income, gross income is tested against a gross income standard, GIS, which is 185% of the consolidated need standard for the appropriate AU, which is an assistance unit, as listed on the Family Assistance Standards Desk Guide. Now, the problem is that the Family Assistance Standard Desk Guide is not in the public domain. You can't get access to it. If you are able to Google and find a link, which I did, you get prompted for a state employee password. You have to have a department password to get in there and see that Family Assistance Standards Desk Guide. So the only way you can fully find out if you're going to be eligible is actually apply, because there are so many different asset or resource eligibility plus income eligibility requirements that it's hard to just do a one-size-fits-all of like, here's a checklist of what you must have to be able to qualify or be eligible for Families First or TANF in Tennessee. Thankfully, even though some of that stuff is behind a private wall where you can't see, even though it's government information and should be, I think, available to taxpayers through sunshine laws, you can go to the Welfare Rules Data Book. It's a state TANF policies book. The most recent one was July of 2019. And this is actually done through funding from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And so they provide funding to create this world welfare rules database. And part of that is this actual document on welfare rules from state to state. Now, you'll notice if we look at the table of contents, and this is just covering determining eligibility, because you'll notice Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, Part 4 is all about eligibility, benefits, different requirements, that kind of thing. And then you get sort of a historical analysis starting on page 234. So from page 12 to page 233 at least, you have, basically over 200 pages of eligibility information. So this is why knowing policy is really hard, because it's going to change. It's different from state to state for programs like TANF, where yes, it's federally funded and there's an umbrella federal agency that's providing block grants, but each state can have very different versions of TANF. So it's very difficult to know, quote unquote, the specific TANF policy eligibility, because it varies from state to state. And even within a state, it's not often easy to find out what that information is. Now, within a lot of the reports out there, different groups that analyze TANF, one of the things you'll notice here, and this comes from that particular database or the particular data book we were talking about that's done every year, and this is the one from July 2019. I just chose a few states here to show you these are the standards for determining eligibility. Now, the standard here means there's some sort of number or standard that's used to determine how much a family needs to get by. In other words, what's required for them to live. You'll notice Arizona, that's the one I've put the arrow next to here, is they actually use the federal poverty guideline to judge how they're determining eligibility for a family of three. That's the name of the standard they use there, is just the federal poverty guideline. You'll notice other states have different ones. Alabama payment standard, Alaska need standard, and Tennessee, as we just read about in the policy, the consolidated need standard. And you'll notice that these vary greatly, and that's because there's a lot of different ways that they look at need. But I just wanted to show you that they have different standards for even determining eligibility and what people are needing. So you can see that Tennessee's not following the federal poverty guideline. They're following something different called their consolidated needs standard, but you can't even determine what that is because it's in that desk manual that's behind the state employee firewall, if you will. This is the maximum income eligible or maximum income a family can have per month and be eligible, be considered eligible for TANF. Now, this is not the only thing. There's also asset limitations and resource limitations. But you can see that in the state of Tennessee, a family with $1,315 a month in income or less could qualify. And that's just an initial qualification for TANF. Where you see, like in Alabama, it's $268 a month, much lower. Mississippi, $457 per month, and so lower. But each state has a different set of eligibility standards as it relates to how, like what kind of car you can have, how expensive the car can be, your house information, other forms of income, lots of other inputs that go into here. So it's not straightforward in understanding how to determine eligibility. That's why it has to be a state-by-state level of understanding. And even within the state, it's difficult to know it. You have to be able to help your clients navigate it, help you understand it, form partnerships and networking with people within those agencies, talk to them, help them get you to, help you understand the full eligibility requirements. So when we say TANF beneficiaries receive funds, exactly how much funds do they receive? So what we see here is a comparison of monthly TANF benefit levels. And this would be a single parent family of three. And you can actually see the amounts from July of 96 to July of 2020. And so if you look at Tennessee, you see for basically 13 years at least, it was $185 a month was the benefit for a family of three, single mom, 2 kids, that amount of $185 a month is much less than most people would think. I've heard a lot of people, say what they think a TANF benefit would be, but there it is for people in Tennessee, $185. Now, in July of 2020, that changed for the state of Tennessee. They upped it to $277. Part of what was recognized is what you see in the right column is the rate at which the benefit has changed in each state as adjusted inflation dollars, meaning has the payment or benefit that people receive kept up with the cost of inflation. And you can see that in all these cases, it is a negative gain, meaning that the value of the benefits has actually gone down from 96 to 2020. Now, Tennessee's has lowered to negative 10%, which is good in that it's come up to 277, so it's getting closer to zero, which meaning the negative 10 is closer to zero, meaning that it would basically be the same value in dollars as it was when it initially started in 96. But you see from other states, they're much lower. And look, Mississippi is still at $170 a month. Alabama, $215, Arkansas, $204, Kentucky, $262. When you say how much would a family of 3 get in a state on TANF, well, it depends on which state it is. It varies greatly. We look at the 277 number, but it's important to note, as I said early on, policy can change at any moment. And at the time of recording this video, policy just changed a few weeks ago. Specifically, June 30th, 2021, the governor's office, Governor Bill Lee, they put out a news release announcing that Governor Lee had signed the TANF Opportunity Act. So just a few weeks ago. And you'll notice it started out, or it's labeled as House Bill 142, Senate Bill 751. So we're going to trace that just a little bit and talk about how that came to be, how policy changes happen. So we're going to use talking about TANF as a way to sort of understand how policy comes about, some of the influences on it. So if we look at the news reports that were out there, like this one from News Channel 5, talking about Governor Lee signing this to modernize Tennessee's TANF program, and noticing that was in June of 2021 that they were doing those news stories about it, we'll go back and revisit the fact that in July 2020, Tennessee's TANF amount for a family 3 was $277. But part of what this TANF Opportunity Act did was increase the amount for a family of 3 from $277 to $387 a month, which is an increase of $110 a month. Now, that's great because a long time, it was stuck for about 13 years, and it increased in 2020, and now we have another increase in 2021. Now, depending on your perspective, you may think that's great or not great. I personally, from my analysis of it, the 277 was still too low, and 387 is a move in the right direction. But part of what we want to look at is why did this even take place? Did suddenly the state of Tennessee, say, oh gosh, we're not giving families enough, and become concerned? Why did this change actually happen? And being able to look at why the change actually happened helps us to look at a particular part of what we're going to look at a little more in detail in a moment. And that's these particular aspects of what we're going to cover. How do you stay aware of proposed changes and actual changes? How can you begin to analyze policy, whether it's working for clients? How can you craft policy? Can you advocate for getting policy changed, for having policy enacted? So we're going to use this example of this TANF Opportunity Act. And why did we get the change from 277 to 387? And why did the governor sign that bill? And we're going to go back to October 2019, so just a couple of years ago, less than 2 years ago. But before we look at what happened 2 years ago, let's look at the organization behind it, and that is the Beacon Center of Tennessee. And you'll notice that their mission is to empower Tennesseans to reclaim control of their lives so that they can freely pursue their version of the American dream. Now, when you look at their description of part of their mission, they're saying that the Beacon Center, they're changing lives through public policy by advancing the principles of free markets, individual liberty, and limited government by giving Tennesseans more control over their lives. And they go on to say, and helping Tennesseans keep more of their hard-earned money. So this is a organization that tends to lean conservative in that they're interested in more free markets, individual liberty, limited government, less taxes. But then they go on to say that they're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, independent organization. They kind of allude to some of their more conservative beginnings, but then they say something that I think is really important to understand about advocacy within social work policy or policy in general. And they say that they make a conscious decision to help solve the problems that impact real Tennesseans through bipartisan collaboration. And this is interesting. They say, we take the words of the late, great Ronald Reagan to heart. My 80% friend is not my 20% enemy, and would even go as far to say that at the Beacon Center, our 5% friend is not our 95% enemy. Ask the ACLU about that. So what they're alluding to there is that they have probably been on side of an issue before that the ACLU also agreed with them on. And the ACLU, normally a more liberal organization, the Beacon organization, normally a more leaning conservative organization, yet they were on the same side on a given issue. And that's why you can't have 100% enemies. You have to realize that with some people, you're going to disagree on 95% of the things, but you have to hold out for that 5% where you find agreement. That's how things get done. That's an important point here. But anyway, that gives you a little background of who the Beacon Center for Tennessee is. And so in October 2019, they issued this report because part of what they do is they research how government's being done in Tennessee. They found the following. Tennessee receives $190.9 million each year through the federal government's Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, TANF. Last year, Beacon found the state spent just $71.1 million of that money, or 37% of the annual block grant amount. And they go on to say that the remaining funds are placed in a reserve fund, which as of September had grown to $732.7 million. The Tennessean newspaper picked up on this in this Beacon report that Tennessee had $730 million in unused block grant funds for poor working families. So basically the TANF block grant that was given from the federal government to the states, over the years, Tennessee has put back $730 million in unused block grant funds. And what's more interesting is that in some of the more in-depth reporting, it was found that Tennessee had actually spent some of its own money doing some things they could have used TANF money for. So basically, Tennessee was not using TANF funds wisely. And so some of the legislators introduced bills to try to address this big backlog of money, or this big reserve of money that they had sitting there. And we're still looking at the fact that we were in the middle of a pandemic. And even though the amount of TANF had increased in 2020, they were saying, you know what, it needs to increase even further as we go forward. So in the most recent legislative year, there were General Assembly members who introduced what had a varying different names through the whole process, but ultimately it was House Bill 142, Senate Bill 751. What you're seeing here is the page from the Tennessee General Assembly's website of the House Bill and Senate Bill. And you can see there under the two red boxes the actions that were taken on the House Bill and Senate Bill respectively. And not all of them fit on this page because there's a much longer list. There was actually several amendments to this bill as it went through committees. You can see there were 3 House amendments and 3 Senate amendments, and there were multiple fiscal memos. That's those little white things you see out to the side there. Fiscal memos means memos that talk about how much this will cost the state. So there was in-depth fiscal analysis done on these amendments proposed to this bill. And then finally, after going through several committees, they reached the floor. And on April 15th of this year, as I'm recording this video, 2021, the vote was 92-0. So unanimous vote in the House. And then in May of 2021, a unanimous vote in the Senate, 32-0, to pass this particular piece of legislation, which included raising the TANF amount, the Families First amount for a family of 3 in Tennessee, $110 from what it was even last year. So that is not just true for families of 3, but that's an example of what it would be for families of 3. So how did that change happen? Well, you had an organization like the Beacon Center who found out this information, put out their report. The Tennessean reported on that extra money that was out there, that Tennessee had been not using all their federal money and in fact even been spending some of their own money when they had been spending federal money. The General Assembly decided to do something about that. Someone introduced bills in the House and the Senate to try to address these issues and to try to more wisely use that block grant funding through TANF. Those bills eventually, after going through several committees, being amended, made it to the House and Senate floors and were passed unanimously in both bodies of the General Assembly, and eventually it was signed into law by the governor. That's how policy change happens. You have advocacy organizations or concerned citizens, or for whatever reason, information makes it to light that shows, hey, we're not serving families as well as we possibly could, whether that be that there's lots of extra money laying around, or whether it be that we're able to demonstrate that needs are not being met some way. Whatever way we can use with usually actual numbers. That's why research is important, and understanding, being able to talk about economics and policy is important, to be able to demonstrate that change needs to happen. And there's a variety of ways to analyze policy, but this particularly was looking at, just look at the extra money we have laying around that we've not used to help families, and we're in the middle of a pandemic where many people have lost their jobs. I would encourage you, if you'd like to do a deeper dive on TANF, check out the document from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. They are an independent organization. They do lean a little liberal because they are advocating for needs for poor families. I find them to be a very reliable source and would encourage you to check them out. There is a PDF of that report that you can click on and get the full PDF of it. And they keep it updated pretty regularly. It was updated just about 6 months ago, or actually more like 5 months ago as of recording this video. So they keep it very updated. So I would encourage you to check that out. If you continually look at TANF in terms of the agency level, we looked at the federal level, the state level, and here's the county and regional district office level. So you have District 7 office, and then you specifically have, like the Madison County office represented here. So you see that reflected in the local contact information. So just understanding the multiple levels of government and agencies that goes into a particular program. Now, for families to apply for Families First, you can actually click on an electronic application on the DHS website, but there is also a printout application that you can do, and that application actually allows for signing up for both Families First and SNAP, or either or. So you can see that there. Now, generally, if a family qualifies for Families First, they're also going to qualify for SNAP, but the reverse is often not true. Sometimes families can be eligible for SNAP and not for Families First, and that's because the SNAP eligibility guidelines allow for a little bit more income, because there's a sliding scale amount of SNAP benefits delivered, and we'll talk about SNAP a bit more in a moment. We covered the basics of TANF. I do want to move just a little deeper into analysis on a pretty controversial issue around TANF. We will do that at the beginning of Module 3. So I want to stop here with Module 2 and maybe briefly hit some highlights of things from Module 2 that you might want to keep in mind going forward. For example, how easy is it to find out eligibility information for each state? How much do states differ from each other? Are they the same? Do they use the same eligibility criteria? Do they have the same benefit amounts for families of 3, for example, as just using a sort of example family size? Can you characterize Tennessee's TANF or Family First payments over the past 10 years? And why was there a recent increase between 2020 and 2021 in the TANF amount for families? What happened to bring that particular change about? We will move on to Module 3, where we'll go deeper into a controversial issue around TANF.